Okay, so now the restricted trade situation. So you'll notice that there are some similarities between the first picture, the free trade picture, and the second one, which is the restricted trade one. Okay, it's the same demand curve, domestic demand curve, same supply curve going up, domestic supply, and same world price. Okay, in other words, they've basically taken the first graph and they've drawn it again a second time. And so they just picked it up and plopped it down again a second time. Except now they're saying, let us pretend, or let us assume that the country now imposes a tariff. Okay, so let's take a look at the left axis here, the price axis. What they're saying is, if you have a world price of, let's say, $10,000 a car, we now tack on this tariff of $2,000 a car. So that means that the domestic consumer has to pay this new higher price, this PD, of $12,000 per car. Okay, so this is basically, we're just shifting up the world price by that distance, the T. Okay, and so now the question becomes, what does all of this mean? Okay. Well, first of all, we now have a higher domestic price. Okay, PD is higher. So the price that consumers see in the the showroom is higher. So if we now look at how this intercepts the supply and demand curve. So we start at PD, that new higher price, and go straight across and see how it intersects the supply curve and the demand curve and what happens. You'll notice, first of all, Q2. Okay? You'll notice that Q2 is less than Q1. Right? Q1, that corresponded to domestic demand for cars. Okay, in the free trade scenario. You'll notice that Q2 is smaller than Q1, right? Because it's closer to the origin, so it has to be a smaller number. So what that right off the bat tells you is that the tariff means that Canadians will be consuming fewer cars. And that's not really a huge, revolutionary discovery. If you raise the prices of cars, people want to buy, well, fewer of them. That's just almost common sense, but it's now been demonstrated graphically. And if we read off the supply curve, this is how many cars domestic car manufacturers want to produce. It goes to Q3. Now notice that Q3 is higher than Q0. Now Q0 was the output of domestic manufacturers under free trade. So notice what we've done. Instead of having the domestic manufacturers producing Q0, they are now producing Q3. So we shifted production to Canadian domestic producers, which might have some spillover effects, like it creates more jobs for Canadians or something like this. Okay, so that basically tells us. So right off the bat, we have a couple of conclusions here. The imposition of the tariff reduces the overall Canadian demand for cars from Q1 under free trade down to Q2. And of course, this means that, and also our second finding was that the domestic producers are supplying more now than they did under free trade. Now, of course, if the total demand for cars is now less, okay, so Canadians want fewer cars in total, and more of these cars are now being produced by the domestic producers, then obviously the foreigners are not going to be able to import as much, right? They're getting squeezed out, so to speak, and that's why it's called trade protection. And that's why, and the amount that they're going to import is the gap between the total demand of Q2 and the domestic supply of Q3. In other words, the gap between Q2 and Q3. And you'll notice that's much smaller than under free trade when it was that big gap between Q0 and Q1. So the number of imports shrinks, okay, which shouldn't be a surprise. Again, because this is about restriction of free trade, so obviously we have to show a lessening of the quantity of imports. Then what they have is these sort of shaded regions. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and 4. What does that mean? Okay, well, let's talk about 1, 2, and 3 first. 1, 2, and 3, what they represent is basically the additional receipts that are earned by domestic producers. Okay, because ultimately the revenue of a company is its price times its quantity. Price times quantity. So the areas of these rectangles, it represents increases in revenue. And so what's going on here, if you look at number 1, the first part of number 1, what that's saying is instead of selling those first couple cars at the world price, we're now selling those cars, the domestic suppliers are selling those cars at a higher price. So they're making an incremental additional profit on each car. So in other words, instead of selling each car for $10,000, they're now selling it for $12,000, and they pocket the extra $2,000, and this goes into the pockets of the producers, the domestic producers, because they're getting the domestic price. And of course, the reason that, you know, when you go over to number 3 and number 2, this is basically saying now we're selling more cars than we used to before, right? And we're getting at a higher price. It's sort of this bigger rectangle like that. Okay, so that's sort of what they're saying there, is we're now selling more cars. So that's the Q0 to Q3 as a domestic supplier, and at a higher price. So we're capturing all of this. It's all going to the, you know, to the pockets of domestic producers. Now you see what number 4 is capturing. Right, number 4 is underneath that gap between Q2 and Q3. Those are the cars that are sold by the foreigners. Now the foreigners don't get the domestic price, they get the world price. The tariff, being the tax, goes to the government. So on all those units from Q2 to Q3, that gap between the world price and the domestic price represents the revenue that the government gets to pocket. That's their revenue generation. By basically earning this sort of incremental or additional tax on all those units that the foreign companies import. But notice that maybe the most important question is who pays for all of these taxes, right? I mean, this sounds great if you're a domestic producer. I mean, you're selling more units, you're getting a higher price. Sounds great if you're a government. I mean, you're getting all this tariff revenue now, you know, more money to spend on social programs or do whatever you want with it, you know. So the government's happy, the business is happy. Who's paying for all this? It's the consumers. The consumers, instead of getting the lower world price, which they would have gotten under free trade, are now forced to pay this much higher price. So consumers get fewer cars, right? They're not getting the free trade quantity, and they're paying more for it. So they're paying more and getting less. And they're paying all these taxes and, you know, this tariff. So the consumers really get shafted in this analysis. They're the ones who lose. They just lose and lose and lose. So that sucks to be a consumer. Next clip, import quotas.